So the topic is process standards and consistency. Hopefully you're all familiar with or understand the importance of having standards and consistency, but maybe I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about it. Obviously, the more consistently that you present, lay out the processes, describe processes, well, there's a number of benefits, but one of the key ones is that anyone who's using those processes, so referring to them, referencing them, especially if you're using Spark as a process library, so you've got a lot of standard processes centralized in there, you've got users coming in to access them, then what it does is it makes it that so much easier for people to be able to read and understand the processes if you've done it in a standard way. So it might be that the first time they look at a process, they have to kind of figure out what the key bits mean. But again, once they've done it once and you've built your processes and documented them in a standard and consistent way, then it makes it that much easier for people to read and follow. So it's really that reducing that cognitive overhead. So for me, that's one of the biggest pieces, because so many problems arise because of misunderstandings about how processes work. Now, documenting a process in the first place helps you to align and overcome some of those misunderstandings. But if you've already got them documented, again, that consistency will again help further to reduce that issue. Other benefits, though, include things like when you're doing analysis, for example. Now, that might be a comparative analysis where you're literally comparing processes side by side, what's different on this one versus that one. Or if you're using data in the process analysis, it could be quantification data, whatever. The more consistently that you have documented and laid the processes out, the more confident that you can be in that data that you're looking at when you're comparing two things. Even just to the point of how you describe processes. If you're comparing two different processes, the more clearly, consistently you follow the standards in how you describe steps in the process, the easier it will be to understand whether you're comparing like for like or apples for apples and so on. So obviously process standards are really important. It's also important from the editor's perspective. So learning to map in Spark or any process tool. Again, if you're either new to the approach that Spark uses or you're new to process mapping in general, we've used an approach that is simple, so should be fairly easy to learn. But again, the more nuances you've got in the process, the more there is to learn, the longer it takes to get used to it. So again, having those standards clearly laid out and visible to your editors will really help them get up to speed as quickly as possible. Now, I'm just going to touch on maybe perhaps the more specific pieces around UPN here. UPN has its simple structure has some really good tools built into it that help analysis at the point of documentation. So when you sit with stakeholders, what UPN is really providing you is a clear and simple structure to ask the stakeholders and the subject matter experts to encourage them to describe what they do, really encourage them to describe it using very clear natural language. So things like the verb noun, if you're familiar with that. I always talk about this as being the key rule in mapping with UPN. Always define activities using a verb and noun. So going back to that point about it makes it really easy for somebody to read the process. If every single activity box in the process flow is being described using verb and noun, makes it so much easier for that user to read it. From an editor's perspective or process mapper's perspective, what it's doing is it's forcing the mapper or the facilitator to really challenge the stakeholders to describe clearly what's happening. People will always try to take shortcuts. Now, Generally, my experience over the years of doing this is that when you ask somebody what they do, how their process works, generally they're quite keen to tell you about it because it's something that they're very closely involved in. So people like to tell you about themselves and what they do. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is getting them to articulate it clearly so that everybody has a shared understanding of it. And the verb noun is for me is one of the kind of key bits of doing that, because you keep sort of going back, going, okay, do you mean this? And you replay what they're saying using a verb and noun. And often, if you've got a group of stakeholders who are in a series of workshops, then they very quickly get used to it, and before too long they start telling you the what the name of the activity using the correct language. And it's exactly the same with the inputs and outputs. I know a lot of people coming to doing process mapping from, say, more traditional flow charting find the inputs and outputs in UPN a little bit frustrating because it's not something they really had to do or think about before, but it is so valuable because it again challenges those stakeholders and subject matter experts to really clarify exactly what's happening in within each step of the process. Not only does it clarify it, but it's also often the point that triggers them to remember all of the little problems, the niggles, and the ideas they have for improving that process. So super valuable. And that's why having some sort of set of standards that you can share with people, especially your process editors, process mappers, is really, really important, because as I said, it will help them as you get them up to speed. So that's really what I wanted to share with you today. So this is a new piece of content that I've been working on recently. I'm sure some of you here will be familiar with the process standards and guidelines process that we'll often put into a new workspace when we create it, or we'll share during the onboarding sessions. We've been using that for a number of years, and it's really useful. It has a lot of information in there, which again covers a lot of the standards. But one of the things that I felt with it was that there was maybe just a little bit too complicated to navigate through, and I wanted to simplify that down, and that's what this is here. What I'm planning to do is make this available on the app share. So again, if anyone wants a copy of it, if you want a copy straight after this, then do let me know. It's the sort of thing that I'd expect you to store in your workspace or in a training area. Maybe you've got a standards or a process excellence area that you want to put it in within your workspace. Make it available for your editors so that they can reference it. You might reference it in various things if you're asking people to review processes and so on. So really what I was aiming to do here is provide something that's basically most of it is on one page, so it's easy to view and use for an editor without having to click around too much. I've got a couple of things in there that might be useful a little bit more. You'll see these little yellow buttons here, which I'll touch on in a second. So as I said, it's about making it easy for people to quickly go and see the standards. Now, the idea is we'd provide this as a default, and then you'd build on it based on how you're using Spark. There are also a couple of features that we've added in Spark since we made the previous version, so I've also included those here as well. So I'll just give you a quick tour of it, really. As I said, I think this will be fairly quick. Just quickly show you around, and then if there's any questions afterwards, then I'm happy to take it, but tried to keep it quite simple. So you'll see straight away, I put up here at the top, the key building blocks of the UPN approach. So we've got the input, the activity, calling out the verb and noun, and the output. I've also put the role and system. So again, just calling out the fact that when you're adding these things to an activity, it might be a role and or a system that is doing that particular activity. And then just a few notes on inputs, activities, and outputs. I've maintained the useful links section as we had before. Of course, these have all been updated. They now include links to things like the Spark user forum on the Netcall community. Again, as a reminder for anyone on here who's not aware of this, there are a series of Spark modules, self-paced training modules on the Netcall Academy, which is also accessible through the community. I think all of these links, except the YouTube one there, is accessible in the Netcall community. So that's community.netcall.com. If you haven't used the community before, you do have to set up a login for the community. But once you've got that login, you can access all of these different resources. We share process templates and examples. So there's a section in the community called App Share. And as I said, I will put this process on there hopefully by the end of the week, so that will be available. The App Share, we've got heaps of processes in there, so if you want to go and look at different things, they're all kind of generic examples. We might find something useful to start with. Spark documentation. So currently we've actually got the documentation in two slightly different places, but this will all be moved, and the latest version of all the documentation will be in the community moving forward. So if you're using the user manual at all, it's definitely worth getting an account on the community. And then finally, I've put the YouTube channel on there. So the bit at the bottom is one of the kind of major new bits, because this is two key bits of functionality we've added to the product. I say key in terms of how it might influence your process standards and how you document a process flow. So the two things that we've added is the activity types. So this is where you can tag activities of different types. So remember, with a lot of this functionality is all customizable. So if you're using activity types, we provide the standards I've put here are all based on what we provide out of the box. I just noticed that I've changed the color of my decision symbol to blue from the standard black, but again, you've got that flexibility to not only add your own icons for the activity type, but also change the color of them. Just as a quick note, if you're not familiar with activity types, it allows you to tag it. So in this case, I'm tagging it. You can see when I hover my mouse over the icon, it highlights it as a decision point. You also get some reporting capability. So as well as visually, you can see the process has a little icon that tells you what type it is. You can also report on the activity types as well. So by default, we provide 3 types: decision, meeting, or automated step, but you can customize and add your own to that. The other thing that we've added, which is slightly more recently, I don't think from memory this is switched on your workspace by default. So if it's not, I think as an administrator you need to go into the general section of the admin panel and switch that on if you want to use it. But it basically works in exactly the same type as same way as activity types, but it's for inputs and outputs. And so you can use this to do things like highlighting a start point from a process or an end point. And again, with this, just to be aware that if you're using the navigation links in Spark, so you're connecting from the end of a process flow on one diagram to the input of a process flow on another diagram, that is the indicator to tell you that process is flowing somewhere else. So you wouldn't necessarily need an input output type on that particular link. But where you've got things like, I don't know, you've got an output from an activity that comes out and it just stops at that point, you can then clearly, here we've got an example. Again, these are default examples, so you can change them, but we've got the idea of a sort of negative endpoint, so you could highlight that. Now, as with all of these things, the more symbols that you put into the process, the more that you have to explain to people what they are or what they mean. Now, some of these are fairly self-explanatory, and just like the activity types there, the user can roll the mouse over them and see what they are. Okay, so it's worth thinking about those. If you're going to use them, review what comes as default, decide whether you want to use those or not. Tidy them up or change them as according to what you use, and then update your standards if you're using something like this. And then the last little thing here is got some general principles. I always recommend to everybody, every process should have a clearly defined purpose statement. have to say I'm a bit guilty of not always doing that. We should always have a process owner, activities described, verb and noun. Outputs do not use the simple past tense. I'm not going to go into the detail of that now, but anyone who's been through onboarding or any of our training should be familiar with that concept. Activities should have at least one input and output. Activities should have at least one role and or system, and use roles. When you're describing roles, use roles, not teams or departments. So that itself could form a very simple checklist before you might go through and approve a process. So got some other things. Layout principles. Again, these are all based on the standard stuff that we would go through in our onboarding session. So if you take this and you do this slightly differently, obviously you'd update these accordingly. But how you typically lay a process out. Again, we always recommend left to right, top to bottom layout. Typically recommend no more than 12 boxes. So by boxes, I mean activities. I should probably clarify that. No more than 12 boxes per diagram. It's a bit of a kind of, sometimes you might add one or two more because it just makes sense to do it, but it's a guideline for doing it. It reminds me as well that often when you're setting up these principles or these standards, if you're using the process health tracker in Spark as well, you would also need to make sure that anything you've defined in your standards aligns with that. So this is a good example of the 12 boxes for diagrams, or the previous page where I had the role and or system against the box. You can define those types of standards in the health checker. So when the health checker runs on the process, it will tell you whether that rule has been met or not. Keep boxes aligned and spaced out evenly. That's all about just trying to make them easy to read. Only display attachments when it adds important information to the reader. What I mean by this, just for clarification, I don't actually have an example on this process, but I could put one in. That's where you can take an attachment on a box. And when you're in editing, in fact, let's go and do it so you can quickly see it for those who aren't familiar. If I were to add an attachment, let me just add a very simple attachment, a text attachment, my example text here. So I'll just click confirm to save that. So remember, as soon as you save an attachment, it gets attached to the box there, the paperclip's visible. If I move my mouse over the attachment, you'll see there's a little eye icon there. And if I click on that, that makes that attachment visible on the box. You can do that with any type of attachment. It's useful sometimes where if you need to provide, say, a link to another system and you want that to be visible on the diagram without the user having to click through on the attachment icon, it can be useful for that. But again, recommendation is to think very carefully about that, because the more information you display on the diagram, the more complex the diagram gets, harder it is for people to read. Okay, so that's a little example there of how that might work. And then other things, very simple view of the approvals. This again has been updated just to remind people that we've got ability to add multiple approvers now. You've got different sequences that you could set up for approvals, which is again new. You can request, when you've requested approval, the approver themselves now has the option to reject that approval request. So again, if that happens, it has to go back to the process editor to re-request it after having made some changes. Other thing I always like to highlight here, which again I think is a slightly underused feature in Spark, but every process has what's called the participants list. So some users get automatically added to it, but you can add your own to that. Now that participant list is just up here, the top right hand side. So normally it'll have if you created the process, it'll probably have your initials up there as well. But if you click on that, you can basically click manage here and you can add more users. Now, what happens with a participant is when a process gets published, they'll get a notification that a new version of that process has been published. So I think that's a really useful tool for people to use. So I always recommend think about that before requesting approval and having the process published. And then just also a little reminder here about reviews. Last thing I've added here. Now I have left some space because I'm sure there are other things that I've forgotten about that might add over time. One of the other key questions that we get from people is, how do I represent a decision point? So again, just kept a very simple example. Most commonly when I'm looking at this with teams, we're generally talking about two different types of decision points. So there's the decision point, most often represented by a diamond in flowcharting, where there's an activity. The activity is followed by a question, and then the answer of that question, which is typically Boolean, so it's a yes/no type question, would then route the process to different places. So in the example I've got here, which is review payment details, what you traditionally have is an activity that says review payment details. Then there'd be a diamond with the question, do payment details match customer details, with a yes and a no. Obviously with UPN, we just describe that in the outputs and that generates the routing. The other key type is where it's like a gate, a decision gate. So it's like a go, no go type decision in the process. Here I've shown that as using that decision type activity in there. But again, you can change this to meet your own particular needs. And that's it.